So as usual, these slides will look familiar because this is very similar to the talk that Lori gave at the PAC meeting not too long ago. So generally speaking, I'd encourage all of you to make sure that you virtually attend those meetings as well, because you can get this information there along with the additional perspective that Lori offers. So next slide, please. So we're finally staffing up in Planetary, which is great news because we have been understaffed essentially since I was hired. And in the past 2 years, we've really gotten the green light to go ahead and start addressing that. So these are some of the people that have been brought on recently. Some people have been brought on prior to this. And it's great to see that we're finally getting enough people to help do the work. It's even greater to see the number of people out there who are interested and willing to come serve at headquarters. So hopefully you will have a chance to work with a lot of these people. Jeff already mentioned Casey Hansen, who I think many of you already know. Casey has been a great addition, and he will be taking over as OPAG Executive Officer after this meeting. You know, one of the parts about bringing on new people is sharing the work. When Casey started up, he and I chatted, and I suggested to him that he consider taking over OPAG, not because I don't love all of you, but simply because, like I said, when you're staffing up, part of it is sharing the workload. And Casey has really stepped up to this and has essentially been running OPAG for the past 4 or 5 months. So I think you will have a very seamless transition. Next slide, please. Next slide. So a little bit about COVID-19. I hope that you've all been taking care of yourselves, taking care of your families. I hope that you've also been attending the regular meetings that town halls that Thomas has been having with his senior staff as well, to understand what NASA has been doing to try to help. And of course, our first priority is everyone's health and safety, not just NASA employees, but the science community as well. We are prioritizing the efforts we're making while also keeping everybody safe to make sure that the missions that are coming up for launch soon are at the top of the priority list, because we're Planetary. We want to make those launch windows, but that's going to be secondary to health and safety. So we are continually gathering metrics from all of our projects and from the science community as well about the impacts. We're continually hearing from you what we can do to help ameliorate those impacts. It's a challenging time. I think you all know that. But I think if we all work together, we'll make it through this and try to make sure that we make it through with as gently and safely as possible. Next slide, please. So short term, the big concern here is making sure that all of the work, all of the work that we use for our processes keeps getting done in as diverse and representative a way as possible. It's more challenging to do that now in many respects. Simply because you go virtual doesn't mean that you automatically can get 100% participation from everybody. The world does not operate that simply. So that is something that needs attention. That is something that has to be addressed. Longer term, the concern is that we might lose people from the planetary science community because of the economic fallout. So we want to try to take steps to avoid that to the extent possible. I trust you've all heard about the opportunity to request augmentations for SMD grants. If you haven't heard about that, please look into it. We are going to have to have a prioritization for that because we don't have infinite money, but it is something that we want to be able to help out with. There's other steps that you can see here as well. I think the short message I want everybody to step away with is, if you need help, speak up. If you need help, ask for it. If we don't have something in place that can help, maybe we can put something in place. But I really encourage you to reach out to somebody at your institution, at NASA headquarters or elsewhere, and make it clear, this is what I need. I was very pleased to see just a day or two ago that NASA headquarters HR sent out an email saying, hey, by the way, for those of you with young families at home, we're going to continue giving excused leave, recognizing that you can't work 40 hours a week if you have a 3-year-old at home. And we don't want you to use up all your vacation time for that. So as I said, if you need help, please reach out. Next slide, please. And next slide. So a little bit about current status. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Let's get to the details and not so much the pictures. You may have heard that Mars 2020 launched, and this was a big moment. There had been a lot of concern because of COVID impacts, pushing back some of the preparations. There were some issues with the launch preparation campaign at Kennedy as well. But the team, in the broadest sense, really pulled off a huge win here. From overcoming the COVID delays, to extending the launch window, to finishing up the launch vehicle prep, everybody really worked hard to pull this off. And it was greeted with wild enthusiasm from not just the United States, but from the entire world. And I won't go through all these metrics. But what I found interesting was that the level of public interest, when you look at these metrics, was even higher for the Mars 2020 launch than it was for our previous launch for InSight. And I think the message to everyone here is people love what you're doing. They love when we send missions to other planets. They love that all of you are exploring, and that more importantly, you are willing to take them along with you as you do it. So I hope you all take that to heart. Next slide, please. OSIRIS-REx, a lot going on with OSIRIS-REx right now. And they have their sampling site picked out, and that was a very arduous process. They've completed 2 rehearsals, most recently what they call the match point rehearsal, which just finished up a couple weeks ago. And everything went very, very well. And in those rehearsals, they actually it was much like the Apollo 10, where, they did everything, got down close to the surface, but then stopped the mission there and backed up. So everything has gone well with those. Everything is on target for the October 20th sampling event, which is called TAG, at the Nightingale site. And we, of course, have the ability to make 3 attempts, but it is hoped that first attempt will be successful. And we should know within a few days after that attempt about how much sample they managed to acquire. So stay tuned for that. That is going to be a very exciting event. But this originally had a movie in it, in that big panel showing us getting closer. It is exciting and alarming to see that happening. So I think this is going to be a great ride down to the surface. Next slide, please. DART, the Double Asteroid Redirection Test. I won't say too much about this. We're still on track for the July 2021 launch, which is only 11 months away. Next slide. Lucy. Lucy is one of the 2 Discovery missions in development right now. It's going to do a tour of the Trojan asteroids. It is also still on schedule for its launch. This slide is about a week and a half out of date because it says that their KDPD was scheduled for August 25th. They passed that KDPD, so they have now begun ATLO in earnest. And everything continues to be moving forward well on that. There are, of course, COVID impacts for both DART and Lucy, as there have been for every project, and we're keeping close track of them and trying to address them as best we can. Next slide, please. Viper. This is the new lunar rover that arose that is going to be delivered by the Commercial Lunar Payload Services effort. This is Ames is doing a lot of work on this. I won't say too much about this simply because of the audience we have here today. Next slide. Europa Clipper. We'll be hearing a lot about this later on from Bob and Jan. Just a bit of a quick overview. The final instrument CDR was back in June. The flight system, the overall project CDR, I should say, is still on schedule for this December, and that will be a huge milestone. We have had some challenges with the instrument cost control, and I'll talk about that quite a bit more during the OPEC findings. So let's put a pin in that. We'll circle back to it. I hope everybody heard the announcement about a month and a half ago now that the gravity and radio science team has been selected. Erwan Mazarico will be leading that team. That was an exciting review experience because I think it was one of the first review panel meetings to be altered and held virtually because of COVID. But the review panel was very diligent and enthusiastic as we had to change the plan on that. I was very happy with their flexibility. Launch vehicle, which is a question we get all the time. I think everybody's aware that there's a law that says Clipper will go on SLS. We've been maintaining dual compatibility for quite some time. But this uncertainty about which launch vehicle will go on is an increasing concern because, as I mentioned, we're going to CDR in a few months. And it is not something we typically do, keeping the launch vehicle unknown this late in the process. So that's something that's getting increased scrutiny at many levels. And I mean scrutiny in a good way. It's getting attention so that hopefully we can resolve it. And finally, instrument and flight hardware. That's what these pictures are. Flight hardware is being built, everybody. And that is absolutely amazing. We actually have instruments that are going to be delivered starting this spring. That's flight instruments that are going to go to Europa, are going to be delivered this spring and mounted onto the spacecraft. Things are proceeding very well on Clipper right now in terms of progress being made. You'll hear more from Jan and Bob about the challenges that they're facing and how they're overcoming them. Next slide, please. Simplex, I won't say too much here. All of the simplices, which let's just go ahead and say that's the plural of Simplex, they're all progressing. We have all of them from Simplex 2 are hitting key decision points in the next month or two. So they're maturing as expected. There are challenges there as well. We're learning as we go. This is a new concept for planetary science. And so we're learning a lot through these experiences. We'll come back to Simplex a little bit in another couple slides. Next slide, please. Mars sample return. I won't say too much here. I will share that we have selected a director for the Mars sample return program. That's Jeff Gramling. For those of you that haven't heard, it's been talked about at a variety of advisory meetings. Mars sample return is going to be managed somewhat similar to JWST, where there's going to be a special office that sort of sticks onto the SMD front office in the org chart so that director will report directly to Thomas Zerbuket. But there's still a lot of coordination that occurs with PSD as well. So Jeff Gramling, I can tell you, is at all of our PSD meetings, is at the staff meetings, he's at the leadership meeting. So there is really a very tight integration between Mars sample return and the rest of Planetary. And it's very gratifying to see that because I think that's very important. Michael Meyer will stay as the Mars chief scientist. He just now wears two hats, the Mars chief scientist for the Mars exploration program, which is still in Planetary. And he's also the Mars sample return chief scientist as well. Unfortunately, he was very disappointed to learn his salary would not be doubled since he's wearing two hats. Next slide, please. Next slide. So opportunities, announcements of opportunity coming up. New Frontiers 5. We are still planning on an October 2022 release for this. That's what we've been saying for quite a while. There's going to be the first community letter will be going out probably the end of this week, maybe early next week. We're waiting for the acquisition website at SOMA to be up and running so we can post it there. But that announcement will essentially say, first of all, we want more engagement with the community as we come up with the parameters for the New Frontiers 5 AO, and then lay out the schedule for what that engagement will be. But the short answer to that is within the next couple of months, we want to go ahead and put out the draft form of the major policies in the AO, like cost cap and other things, and then have a few months to engage with the community, get feedback on those draft policies, and then next late winter, maybe early spring of 2021, go ahead and put out the final form, the final parameters for those major policies, because there are some questions that the proposers need to have answered as soon as possible so they can begin working on their proposals in earnest. Things like, what's the launch readiness state? Are there nuclear power sources allowed? What's the cost cap? So we want to get that information out to the community as soon as possible, but we also want to give everybody a chance to give us feedback on what those parameters are, rather than just, next month tell you the cost cap is $3 and you're not allowed to have any nuclear power sources. We want to hear from you and put out a much more collaborative AO than we have in the past. Simplex 3. That AO will be released no earlier than April 2021. And frankly, given the COVID situation and the impact that'll have on our finances, we don't know when it will come out. All we know is that it will not be any earlier than April 2021. And Discovery 2019 remains on schedule. The 4 teams have been working on their concept study reports. They're due in November, and we are still on track for a selection in April 2021. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about New Frontiers 5. I hope you have all had a chance to take a look at the CAPS letter report that they provided about New Frontiers 5. We posed a few questions to them that we wanted them to weigh in on, questions about what should be on the mission theme list for New Frontiers 5. You can see a summary of their findings right on this slide, but what it comes down to is keep Enceladus in, but take Titan out, since we just selected Dragonfly for New Frontiers 4, which I think is an eminently reasonable conclusion. In addition, given the given the overlap between Lucy and the Trojan Toward Rendezvous mission theme in terms of their science content, CAPS recommended that we consider removing that from the New Frontiers 5 list. And similarly for IO Observer, if IVO is selected for Discovery, given the overlap between that mission and what's in the Decadal for IO Observer, we should consider taking that out of New Frontiers 5 if it is selected by Discovery and retains the science objectives that have been proposed. And finally, for Lunar Geophysical Network, the CAPS concluded that there was nothing new that has happened that should cause NASA to consider taking that off the list. So those are the 4 questions we posed them. Should we consider taking Ocean Worlds off, Trojan Toward Rendezvous off, IO Observer off, and LGN off? They gave us their recommendations for each of those. And of course, we placed great weight on their findings, and we will weigh them heavily when we make the final decision of what's on and off the mission list. Next slide. The PSD is undergoing an audit by the Office of the Inspector General. Nobody panic. This is something that happens on a fairly regular basis, and in fact, the IG has been working through every one of the SMD divisions so they can assess how we're going about achieving our goals, what practices we're using, things like this. This is a good thing to have happen. It's beneficial to have an external organization come in and take a look at how you're doing business. So they're finishing that up right now. Once we have the results, we'll share them with the PAC and along with our responses to their recommendations. Next slide, please. RNA, next slide. I already mentioned the augmentations that are available because of COVID-19 impacts. We're, of course, doing completely virtual review panels. So Stephen Reinhardt, who's now the RNA lead, along with the rest of the RNA group, wanted to extend a thank you to everybody that has served during these virtual review panels. They tend to take more time because it's not as efficient as being face-to-face. They're more challenging to schedule because it's much easier to command 100% of somebody's attention when you lock them into a hotel ballroom as opposed to when they're home with their families. So it has taken more work. It's taken more dedication on the part of the program officers and the reviewers as well. And finally, dual anonymous peer review. That has been getting tried out kind of a piecemeal in SMD. PSD is going to step up and take a swing at it as well with the Habitable Worlds program under ROSA's 2020. And at the bottom there, you can see some near-term due dates. Next slide, please. Raising astrobiology's profile. I think everybody realizes that astrobiology is a theme that runs through much, if not nearly everything that Planetary does. So there is a new effort to better acknowledge the central role it plays in most of our missions. So this is just an effort that's being started up. So when you see astrobiology being mentioned more, hear more about it, this is the driving force behind that. Next slide, please. Artemis III. The Artemis is the human return to the moon effort that is underway in human exploration. So we are actually starting up a science definition team to provide some science objectives for the Artemis III mission. Renee Weber at Marshall is going to be chairing that. They are getting organized right now. So for those of you interested in lunar work, please keep an eye out for that. Next slide, please. Decadal survey next. So a big thank you to Robin Kennep and Phil Christensen for agreeing to chair the Decadal survey. I think everybody probably noticed that one of the first things they did was provide you the relief that the community had been asking for with the white papers. So kudos to them. I will not say any more about this because Robin and Phil are going to be talking to all of you later. Next. And timeline for the Decadal survey. David Smith is going to be talking about this right after me, I think. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So assessment and analysis group updates. I think that the steering groups know this, but just so everybody knows that the charters for all the AGs have been updated and sort of standardized across each of the AGs because there was a lot of variation and Lori wanted to see a bit more standardization. I mean, to give you an idea of how much this varied, I think the original OPAG charter was 2 sentences because that's what Fran and I came up with back in 2004 or so. Whereas the more recent AGs have 4 or 5 pages. So all of the executive officers at headquarters got together, sort of hammered out a decent template, and then each executive officer worked with the steering committee, with their steering committee, to put in some puts and takes to customize it as needed. We have also started up the MEXAG, the Mercury Exploration Assessment Group. And by the way, as part of those headquarters discussions about the charters, the amount of time we spent debating assessment versus analysis was really painful. And actually, I don't even remember where we ended up. But in any case, that's where we are with the assessment/analysis groups. Next slide, please. All right, the fun stuff, response to the findings. Europa Clipper. So at the last OPAG meeting, Jan mentioned that we were burning through reserves unacceptably quickly on Clipper. OPAG had a finding saying, hey, let's make sure we don't lose any payload because of the low cost reserves. So my first response to this was, we never considered eliminating anything on the payload to try to replenish cost reserves. That would be foolish. But more broadly, we do have a problem with cost growth on the payload. So we want to maintain the entire payload, but we have had some problems in this area. So let's talk about this a little bit. Next slide, please. So we've been largely successful in dealing with the recent cost growth on the payload, recent being the last 2-3 years. But late last fall, it became clear that 3 of the instruments, ICE, MASSPEX, and MISE, were experiencing some worrisome cost growth. We followed the cost containment process, which is colloquially known as the trigger process. And early this calendar year, the PIs for those instruments came to headquarters to discuss the situation with Lori and with Thomas. There were 2 main outcomes of that. First was that the cost containment process was ended for the payload. It was felt that at the stage we were at for Europa Clipper, it had done what we needed it to do. So we're done with it. The second was that a continuation/termination review was organized for ICE, MASSPEX, and MISE. As part of that review, an independent risk assessment team was formed to do exactly what it sounds like, to provide an independent assessment of the current situation for those 3 instruments. It was expected and communicated to everyone that the likely and possible outcomes for that review were to continue on as planned if the risk was found acceptable, to make some changes if the risk was not acceptable, or to terminate if the risk was insurmountable. So in April, the risk assessment team worked with the project and the instrument teams. In May, they reported back to SMD and to the project and to those instrument teams. So based on those results and the discussion centered around them, Thomas Zerbuchen, the associate administrator, made some decisions. I'll walk everybody through those decisions so you know what decisions were made, but more importantly, why they were made. But the short version of this is we are flying the entire payload. Nothing was terminated. Every decision that Thomas made was intended to maximize the chance that we retain the entire payload. So keep that in mind. That's the touchstone. So headquarters wanted to do everything within its control to keep the payload intact. But I want to stress that doing everything we can does not mean simply writing a blank check for cost overruns for either the payload or other systems, because that means the mission doesn't get to the launch pad. We simply can't afford it. We've got to control cost risk on this mission, and that goes for every subsystem, not just the payload. And I want to stress that because this came up at, I believe it was the CAPS meeting, where somebody commented, we keep hearing about the payload's overrunning, the payload cost risk, so we've got to control the payload. And my response to that was, that's because you're a science committee. We have similar discussions about the thermal system or about the solar panels as well. And if we had a solar panel advisory group, they would probably complain that we're talking about the solar panels too much. So yes, the payload gets a lot of attention, but I would not agree with the assertion some have made that it gets more attention than anything else. So just keep that in mind. All right, so what you see on this slide is the risk assessment that the risk assessment team came up with for those instruments for 3 cases. That first column represents the situation when the risk assessment team started back in April, May. The intermediate column allows the technical constraints and to a certain extent the schedule to float, but it keeps cost steady, or it keeps cost constant, I should say. It doesn't really allow cost growth. And then that full column is what happens when you let everything float: cost, schedule, technical requirements. The key takeaway here is that the only acceptable solution space from a risk point of view was that full case. That is the only thing that gets you even close to green across the board. And even in that situation, MASSPEX was still in a particularly risky situation. This was a very, very painful realization. What this essentially said was that to get the cost risk under control, you have to do everything. You have to change the cost. You have to change the schedule. You have to change the technical requirements. So let's jump in and talk about each instrument in turn. MISE was rated yellow, and the risk assessment team felt that the MISE team had really come a very long way. They had stabilized their technical status and their technical progress. They came through a lot. Much of it was externally forced, but the team responded to those challenges very admirably. They solved them. But that admirable response cost, schedule, and money. But once you account for all of that, that's why you see MISE going from yellow in that first column to green as you move to the right. And that's exactly what you want to see. So the decision for MISE was that first option I talked about a few minutes ago. Simply continue on. Manage it just like the other 7 instruments on the payload. So we're good to go on MISE. The ICE, the camera system, was also rated yellow, although I would suggest that this is a somewhat different shade of yellow than you see on MISE. There are some technical issues driving development. I don't think anyone would characterize those technical issues as showstoppers or alarming or unexpected, but coupled with the growth that we were seeing, it presented a concern, simply because if that growth continues, we have a problem. An obvious answer that was tossed out was in that intermediate column. Just terminate the wide angle camera. Take the money and the effort you save and apply it to the narrow angle camera, get that back in the box. But the obvious answer does not mean that it's the right answer, because our goal here is to reduce cost risk. And you'll notice that even if you take WAC out of the equation, it's still yellow. So you're not achieving your goal of getting that risk into the green. So in order to achieve the goal of reducing cost risk and avoid termination of the WAC, we decided to do 2 things. First, provide a cost cap to ICE overall, WAC and NAC added together, and empower the PI Zebby Turtle to manage both the cameras and their development activities within it, giving a clear priority to NAC. Second, we're adjusting the level 1 requirements to remove reliance on the WAC. And we did this because simply applying a cost cap and telling somebody, hey, don't spend more money than this, does not provide flexibility to either Zebby or to the project to manage this and get the cost risk under control. So instead, the message was, we will provide the additional money and schedule you need. We're going to let you manage within that, and we're letting you know that if you need to, the level 1s are now being adjusted so that we, in the most general sense, can fly without the WAC. If you need to go there to stay under the cost cap, do it. But we're not forcing it on you. So that's the situation we're in with ICE. Finally, finally, MASPEX. Overall, the risk assessment team felt that MASPEX was red. I will say that the situation deteriorated further during and after the work that the risk assessment team did. But I think everybody realizes that Clipper is a habitability mission. And while MASPEX is by no means the only habitability instrument we have, it's clearly a very, very important habitability instrument. So based on the report and the briefings, SMD really felt that significant relief was needed to avoid termination and fly an adequate cost-controlled mass spectrometry investigation. We wanted to provide the most flexibility possible to the project and to the MASPEX team, so we pulled out all the stops. Every knob that headquarters has under its control, which at this stage of development is not a lot of knobs, is being turned in an effort to bring MASPEX along without continued cost growth. So what are those knobs? First, just like ICE, provide a cost cap to MASPEX and empower the project and the MASPEX team to manage their activities within the cap. Also similar to ICE, adjust the level 1 requirements to remove reliance on MASPEX. Because again, just giving a cost cap doesn't give any flexibility. It's just foolish. Telling the team don't spend any more money than this is neither helpful nor success oriented. You've got to do other things to give them the flexibility to stay within that cap. In addition, we went beyond what the risk assessment team suggested. We defined the performance floor as something that we call the ambient flyby performance regime, which Bob is going to tell you more about during the Clipper talk. But what NASA is essentially saying here is, we are fine with flying a less capable instrument that doesn't have as great a science return. What headquarters is not doing is directing changes to the instrument or dictating descopes. I immensely dislike headquarters making technical design decisions. We are simply saying, this is the performance floor you must meet. It is lower than what we have talked about in the past. But we gave you a cost cap. We're lowering our performance expectations as well. Stay within the cost cap and above this lowered floor. It's important to note that, as I kept saying, it's the floor. We're not saying you can't go below this. Well, I'm sorry, we are saying you can't go below this. What we are not saying is you are forbidden from doing better than this. Okay, the moment we made this decision, MASPEX didn't go and start ripping out components. It's too late to change the design. But we are trying to give MASPEX the flexibility during the rest of their build to make the decisions that are necessary to stay within the cost cap. Next, we decided to make MASPEX Class D as in dog. All the other instruments are Class B as in bird. Obviously, it's too late to change the design or to return the Class B parts to the vendors for cheaper Class D parts. But this decision has implications for simplifications in verification and validation and other areas that remain ahead of us that could be beneficial, that could reduce risk, could reduce costs, could reduce schedule. And again, headquarters is not saying you have to work toward this, but we're saying you should use this as needed to stay within your cost cap. In addition, the mission contamination control requirements are being loosened to the levels, less stringent levels that SUDA and UVS needs. This provides other instruments on the payloads some of the relief that they need. And finally, it was decided that a new PI was needed to lead MASPEX. Jim Birch, who I think many of you have heard of, has been appointed as the acting PI. Jim has PI'd multiple missions in the past. He's delivered a lot of flight hardware in the past himself and overseen its delivery as PI. And it was really felt that given all those decisions I mentioned over the past few minutes, you need somebody with that depth of flight delivery experience that Jim Birch has to really take advantage of that flexibility and squeeze as much benefit out of it as possible. And Jim feels confident given the increased schedule and increased budget, and along with the rest of this flexibility, that MASPEX can be delivered as planned and perform as planned, but he's also committed to taking advantage of that flexibility to stay within the cost cap. So that's where we are with the three instruments. And I talked for a really long time about that. So let me jump through that. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Let's talk about the other findings. IC satellite technology. To paraphrase, you want to know what we're spending the FY20 money on. The short answer is the latter part of the response here. $2 million on PESTA, which is the PSD Technology Coordination Office. They're helping oversee this money. $2.3 million to finish out some Matisse awards, and less than $1 million to support some intelligent landing system work for IC satellite landers. The bulk of the money we received from Congress in FY20, we are reserving right now because we are moving away from a year-to-year implementation strategy where we say, oh, we got some money from Congress. How are we going to spend it and spend it all this year? And we're moving toward a more long-term, not to sound like a bureaucrat, but a long-term end-to-end strategy for technology development for IC satellite mission. What this means is we want to decide what is our long-term goal, say to meet 10 years from now, and what are the steps we need to take this year, next year, the year after that, in 3 years and 4 years, and lay out technology development efforts multi-year to meet that 10-year goal. Rather than what we've done in the past is just say, where can we spend this money this year that we got from Congress? So that's the plan right now. Hopefully within the next month, we will finish that up and roll it out for the community to see. Next slide. Finding three, expanding the research collaboration networks has suggested NASA start a giant planet system science one. Right now, RCNs are very new. They're an experiment. So we're not planning on doing a giant planet one, but it's important to note that the RCNs are not a funding line. They're simply a mechanism for bringing together researchers that are already funded in different programs. It was felt that astrobiology was an ideal one for that since its programs are scattered. So we're going to wait and see how the RCNs work, learn from that experience, and then decide how to move forward. Next slide. Dual anonymous peer review. I already mentioned this before. Habitable Worlds is going to do that in ROSAS 20 for ROSAS 21. We're going to expand it to all the data analysis programs, and then we will assess the results and decide how to proceed. Next slide. EDI demographic and climate surveys. So in the interest of time, let me just jump to the NASA response. We're at SMD is currently working with the Academy to initiate a study. We looked at a lot of different options, and what we had to do is restrain our appetite and focus on things that are achievable in the near to midterm. Because some of the things we were considering were huge 5-year efforts, perhaps even a decadal survey kind of effort. So what we're doing right now is asking the National Academy to assess what types of information NASA should routinely collect so that we can better assess and understand the diversity in our communities. And this is not just Planetary, this is SMD overall. And I think everybody recalls that the Decadal survey has also been tasked to discuss this. So short answer is we're going to work with the National Academies on this, and we're going to see what the Decadal survey has to say. Next slide. Advanced RPS availability schedule. You said you want a briefing, so whenever OPEC has time, we're of course happy to have RPS program have June come and tell you guys what's going on. Next slide. And that's it.
All right, thanks, Curt. Well, we have a little bit of time, about 5 minutes, so let's go out to the Google Docs monitor and see if we can have a quick question and answer before we start with the next speaker.
Thank you, Jeff. Looking at the document here, there are a number of questions about the early career.
I'm up next, so give me a few minutes to be, yeah.
So the first question here is, what was the rationale for deciding early career corresponds to no more than 7 years post PhD, whereas the ROSAS early career grant defines that group of individuals as being no more than 10 years post PhD? And is there going to be some consideration of special circumstances to extend that?
I have received questions from people about the special circumstances. And what I've been telling them is, if you had to take a hiatus, take a break from planetary science for personal reasons, yeah, well, I'm fine with stopping the clock. So simply put a note to that effect in the letter that you provide, a sentence, so that we're aware of it, and go ahead and submit. Okay. I would like to suggest, just as a personal observation, taking 3 years off to raise a family is a wonderful reason to stop the clock. Taking 3 years off to surf, not as wonderful.
Okay. Related question here. The early career opportunity for grad students and early career folks sounds great. What is the duration of these opportunities, and are these funded opportunities? Will support be provided for time and travel?
Yep. So eventually, when we resume face-to-face meetings, if we decide to continue this, this would provide a travel grant so that these recipients could attend the meeting in person. For now, with the virtual meetings, there's no financial arrangements being made. It's simply attend the virtual meeting, just like all the other science team members are. I would like to point out, and Linda alluded to this, this is a pilot program. This is an idea. This isn't my idea. This is something that all of you have suggested. That's something the community has suggested. So we're trying it out as a pilot on these 3 missions. We'll see how it goes. And if there's enough, if the feedback we receive is that, yeah, there's a lot of benefit to this, then we will expand it to more missions. We'll fix the bad parts. We'll expand it to other missions. We'll put maybe we'll put a travel grant in there so that we can do face-to-face meetings, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, there's a number of mission questions here. First off, has the GRS team membership on Clipper been publicly announced?
Yeah, the abstracts should be posted on Nspires. That's usually the only sort of public announcement that we usually do. We did not put out a press release or anything like that.
Okay. Is any change in the New Frontiers target list expected for the New Frontiers 5 call?
Stay tuned for the community announcement.
Okay. Is there anything more that could be shared about level 1 required changes for EIS and Massplex?
Oh yeah, I should have mentioned that. Bob's going to talk about that. Bob's going to show those changes and talk about them more in his in the Clipper talk.